Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. And welcome to Eisenhower National Historic Site. My name is Matt Borders. I'm an interpretive ranger, and it is my absolute pleasure to have you all here today for the World War II weekend, which is commemorating 1944. To jump into our first presentation today, Dr. McManus will be speaking on his work, September Hope, the American Side of a Bridge Too Far. While the destruction of the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden is well known and a sad tale, in part because of the famous book and movie A Bridge Too Far, lesser known to the experience is the experiences of the two United States Airborne Divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, both of which jumped into Holland in September of 1944. On this 80th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, Dr. John McManus tells us the story of these American divisions, from their misbegotten conception of Market Garden to the valorous last-ditch attempts to snatch victory from the very jaws of a tragic defeat. Dr. McManus is the Curators Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at Missouri University of Science and Technology. He is one of the nation's leading military historians and has authored 15 different books. His works have received numerous awards, including the Army Historical Foundation's Distinguished Writing Award and the Gilder Lehrman Institute's Prize for Military History. Dr. McManus does frequent speaking engagements ranging from, and this is quite the list, CNN, Fox News, C-SPAN, the Military Channel, the Discovery Channel, the National Geographic Channel, Netflix, the Smithsonian Network, the History Channel, and PBS, among others. In addition, he is the host of two podcasts, Someone Talked, in tandem with the National D-Day Memorial, and We Have Ways of Making You Talk in the USA, alongside Al Murray and James Holland. So please give us a warm welcome for Dr. John McManus.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time and trouble to be here today. And I'd like to thank Dan Vermiglia, too, who an old friend of mine, and I know did a lot of the organization for this. And World War II weekend is absolutely incredible. See all the reenactors out there, and it's just, I love it. I love the immersion, and I love to try and bring history to life. So that's what I'm going to try to do for you this morning, is maybe bring the American airborne experience in the Netherlands to life for you, and give you a little perspective on the on Market Garden. And of course, we are right here in the shadow of the great Dwight Eisenhower's retirement home. I want to give you a fair warning, I'm going to be a little critical of him today, but I do come in peace, so from a point of love for Eisenhower, but this was not his finest hour in my view. But so, yeah, September Hope is the name of the book. Let's see, I always mess the technology up. That's the beauty of coming from a technological university. I always find a way to screw it up. But so you're looking here at the situation in the European theater post-Normandy. Okay, so late summer 1944, and then we can kind of see where Market Garden comes from, how it's conceived, why Eisenhower gives the go-ahead for it, what is the whole backstory. So your situation at that point is that Germany is absolutely reeling, both east and west. Now, we don't see it on our map, of course, but the Soviet armies have inflicted hammer blows on the German armed forces that summer 1944. We don't tend to remember this very well in the West, but in the wake of D-Day, about 2 weeks later, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, which was a major operation on the Eastern Front that destroyed hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and German armies in the East, and it led the Soviets to get into Poland, and so the Germans are absorbing that. And then, of course, in the West, they have their back broken at Normandy. They lose the better part of two armies in Normandy. And then on the heels of that, you've had a very successful invasion of South France, which we tend to forget that too, Operation Anvil Dragoon, which was really quite important in destroying the German position in France. So the Germans were basically on the Western Front in headlong retreat back home. And they were in a state of chaos. They were in a state of disrepair. They were having manpower problems. Obviously, their communications network is destroyed. Their diplomatic position is more or less, eroded to the point of being destroyed in Europe. Germany seems, in short, on the brink of total collapse. We in the Allied world have liberated the better part of most of France. Allied armies have plunged into Belgium. They're on the gates of Holland. In the Italian theater, of course, the Allies had liberated Rome in June, and of course, it only advanced farther north. There was just no good news for Germany at this point in the war. And on top of it, from Hitler's point of view, there had been an attempt on his life. And of course, on July 20th, 1944, during the Battle of Normandy, some of his generals tried to kill him, and he was just simply lucky in order to have survived. So it really appears as if Germany is on the verge of collapse. And that's the good news. The bad news is, in some ways, we are victims of our own prosperity, because the farther east those armies advance, the tougher it is to supply them. The road and rail network in Northern Europe, in France, and the portions of Belgium in which we're operating are more or less destroyed, and by design, because this is a pre-invasion thing, the Allies had launched what was called the Transportation Plan to basically destroy a lot of the French road, rail, and bridge network so that German armies could not get to the beachhead in Normandy, so that you could isolate the battlefield and thus get ashore. So now we're experiencing the flip side of that coin, in which you have a kind of transportation net that is traumatized. In addition, of course, you don't control enough deep water harbors. Hitler, of course, is famous in this war for his no retreat orders, and often they're quite nonsensical in the open space of the Eastern Front, say. But they do make sense in the context of the English Channel ports, because the Allies need those ports in order to sustain their armies on the continent, so it makes sense to deny them the control of those ports as long as you can. So those garrisons are hanging on there. And then once they are overwhelmed, they destroy a lot of the harbor facilities, most famously, obviously, at Cherbourg. Okay, so logistically, we don't control that many harbors. The mulberry harbors are artificial harbors that we have designed, to try and pick up some of that slack, have not had the kind of effect we want, mainly because of a terrible storm that had come in June 18th to 20th in Normandy that destroys the American mulberry harbor on Omaha Beach and really damages the British one. So really, in terms of getting our supplies ashore, it's mainly LSTs and other ships coming up to the beaches, unloading, and then we're putting stuff on trucks and moving as much freight east as we possibly can. The famous Red Ball Express, a lot of African-American drivers, round the clock, incredible dedication to this mission. In addition, you've got transport aircraft being used for this purpose too, to some extent, to fly gasoline forward, to fly ammo forward and whatnot. And really, that's just a hand-to-mouth operation. So every yard you advance east only makes your logistical situation that much more difficult, thus limiting your options. So the Allied armies are beginning to slow down as we get into September 1944. Britain, by this point, is very war-weary. Britain has endured 5 terrible years of war. It's obviously seen its cities bombed, many of its civilians killed. It's at the end of its manpower and financial tether. The United States has really become the dominant partner in the Allied coalition by this point, setting the tone for the future. The campaign that's going on right now in Western Europe is primarily American, about 2/3 American in terms of the manpower and almost all the financial power and a lot of the materiel power. So Britain is really in a bad state in a way. The other thing that has happened too that I think we tend to overlook is that the V2s have come into play. Those are the new weapons, the rockets that the Germans are going to hurl everywhere and anywhere as just indiscriminate weapons of destruction, including against Britain itself. So that comes into play in September 1944 at a time when the British public have just gotten past the Blitz, they've just gotten past the V1 assault that had gone on earlier in the summer, and now this. So you can imagine what that would be like for you as a British citizen, and how that affects British commanders. So in all of this, as we've seen the armies advance east, the airborne units that had fought in Normandy have been redeployed back to England to be refitted. And they've been on the sidelines then for a number of weeks, and these are some of Eisenhower's best troops, that are sort of, on the bench, and there's a lot of frustration with that in airborne circles and higher command circles. So at this point, he's really kind of mulling over what's the last stage of our move into Germany going to consist of? How are we going to do this? And there's basically 2 choices, perhaps to oversimplify it, but to boil down. You can try a single thrust or single front approach in which you put all of whatever logistical heft you've got into one push into Germany. Whether that's going to be, famously under Bernard Montgomery, who had become a field marshal as of September 1st, his 21st Army Group in the northern part of our map there that's moving into Belgium, whether it's going to be General Patton's 3rd Army farther to the south, whether it's the 6th Army Group even farther to the south, whatever. Are you going to go in the single thrust in an attempt to try and score that knockout blow to bring Germany to its knees right there? Or are you going to have a more deliberate, broad shoulder, broad front kind of advance to overwhelm Germany, which will be, as I said, a bit more deliberate, take a little bit more time, but will really maximize your advantages that you've got over these guys of manpower, material power, financial power, all those kinds of things. And Eisenhower's really much more disposed toward the broad front approach. Makes total sense. And that's certainly an American strategic attrition kind of approach to warfare. Eisenhower is very much an inheritor of the Grant-Lincoln form of warfare that had overwhelmed the Confederacy with this kind of attrition, especially in 1864. Eisenhower really is seeking to emulate Grant on many levels. The parallels between them are almost eerie in some ways, but so he is predisposed to be thinking of that. That's an American point of view. Okay, so that's where he is in terms of when we get to September 1944, but physically he's very remote from the battlefield. Now you're looking there at this map, very busy map, but it does give you a good overview of where the armies are, how they're advancing, and all that. So he is actually in western Normandy at that point in time, at a place called Granville. So his headquarters is quite hundreds of miles from the front line, and that's a point of great frustration to Montgomery. The communications are spotty. I mean, this is almost like 19th century kind of stuff in terms of being out of touch with his commanders far, far, far to the east. He's got a physical issue at this point. He has wrenched his knee. Some of you may know he was a really good football player at West Point until he hurt his knee. And so he'd had a good knee the rest of his life. Now this one got hurt in an airplane accident, not a crash or anything like that, but he and his pilot were trying to move a small aircraft that he had traveled in, move it off a beach before the tides came in, and he wrenched his knee, and so his mobility, his personal mobility was a bit limited too. So frustration has built up among some of Eisenhower's subordinate commanders about his remoteness from the battlefield and about what we're going to do next. And many of them are jockeying for priority for a perhaps single thrust into Germany. And of course, none more so than the famous Montgomery. So they finally meet on September 10th, 1944, aboard Eisenhower's plane. Eisenhower had trouble getting on and off the plane, so they meet aboard the plane and the tarmac of the Brussels airport to discuss the situation. And Montgomery being Montgomery, of course, I'm sure he's not terribly popular in this tent because he really isn't in America, right? I mean, and of course, from the movie Patton, he's made the villain in the foil and all that, and that's all fun stuff. But let's think about things from Montgomery's point of view a little bit too. He is a very, very experienced combat officer from World War I. He's lucky to have survived. He's led troops in this war for a long period of time. He's seen a lot of war. He knows what he's doing on many levels, and he's a very humane person. But he also represents Britain in the sense of, my power is ebbing here. And I've got enough left for one more punch, and I need Britain to be sort of front and center in this last stage of the war, is kind of how he's seeing it. He is, of course, famously parsimonious with his manpower because he doesn't have much. But the thing about Montgomery is he's his own worst enemy. He just can't help himself from saying incredibly obnoxious things, from being self-centered, from being, self-serving. All those things we associate with him are absolutely true. So when he meets with Eisenhower on September 10th, he's his own worst self, hectoring Eisenhower for the lack of communications. He's showing him the messages and talking about, this is just sheer rubbish. It's like a school teacher, browbeating a kid or something, and Eisenhower has to lean forward and famously touch him on the knee and say, "Steady, Monty, you can't talk to me like that. I'm your boss," And to Montgomery's credit, he's like, "I'm sorry, Ike." So then he's like, "Okay, we've made peace a little bit here, but I've got a new concept for you." And we all, of course, know Montgomery is being cautious, don't we? But he's got a bold plan. And the bold plan is, of course, what becomes known as Operation Market Garden, to drop airborne divisions behind the German lines in the Netherlands to capture key bridges over Europe's major river systems there in northern Europe, and then link up with armor and the army will get across the Rhine, and this is your single thrust. Okay, so what happens next is always a little bit opaque. I guess we're just going to go to Berlin and live happily ever after somehow and be home by Christmas or whatever. It's a bit fairy tale-ish in my opinion, but it's also pretty intriguing to use the airborne that's been backbenched to put them front and center now and to link up with some of your best armored forces in British 30 Corps. Get across the Rhine River, outflank the western defenses that Germany has on its frontier, known as the Siegfried Line, and maybe, you know, Hitler's Reich maybe is ready to collapse. So Eisenhower is intrigued with this, and he decides to give the go-ahead for Operation Market Garden, seeing it as, you know what, I'm going to grab a bridgehead and just develop it. I'm going to get across the Rhine. There's no downside to that. Let's see what happens with this, and yes, we've got to get the airborne back into the game. The great Charles MacDonald, who was a participant in World War II and later an incredible historian of it, you know, he talked about the airborne divisions, and he was talking about Eisenhower's headquarters, Schaeff, and he said the airborne divisions are like coins burning a hole in Schaiff's pocket. You know, and it's like this wealth you're not using, and there was some level of truth to that. So, so Monty's plan is really intriguing to Eisenhower. Why does he give the go-ahead? Again, because he sees it as a bridgehead. He doesn't understand at the moment he makes that decision, you are letting go of the broad front. You are investing in a single thrust, a kind of a gamble, what I call a military Hail Mary pass to try and end the war somehow. All predicated on the notion that the Germans are near the end. And that's why I call the book September Hope. It's based on hope and not reality, unfortunately. But you've got to remember, too, this generation of senior officers had experienced the fall in 1918, when the Kaiser's Germany had collapsed, really shockingly, suddenly, ending World War I in November 1918. So Germany seems to be in the same place again in 1944, and so it seems to make sense in the minds of Montgomery, Eisenhower, and others that if we just hit them with one stunning knockout blow, they're going down. Okay, but there's no good intel to support that beyond just hope that this could be true. Okay, so how does it all work? Here are the guys who are going to do it. I love this picture because it shows you the sort of identity, face, and spirit of the American Airborne at that point in time. This is just one stick from the 82nd Airborne, I think the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and a stick is basically a plane load of paratroopers, if you've never heard that term. It's 14 to 18 troopers, and you can see them here lining up, getting ready to go on Operation Market Garden. Basically, Market is the part of the operation in which the airborne troops will be dropped behind German lines. Garden is the armored part in which they're going to punch through the German lines and link up with these guys. So you'll notice they've got their chutes, including their reserve chutes right in front. A very American thing. We're going to protect your life as much as possible. You got a regular chute and a reserve chute, so, you know, hopefully out of between the two, you'll one of them will deploy, right? We don't want to plunge to our deaths. So, yeah, I mean, there they are. You can see these guys, what they're like. These are really outstanding soldiers. They're all volunteers. They've endured really intense training in order to be a paratrooper. You know, that obviously is their thing. So, as I mentioned, there's going to be 3 Allied divisions that are going to drop behind the German lines. The key objective, of course, is the British 1st Airborne Division that'll be dropped in the Arnhem area, which is closest to the Rhine, and they are to take that so-called bridge too far, as we call it, the bridge over the Rhine, which you have to have for this operation to make any sense. And by the way, where did that term come from, bridge too far? Obviously, Cornelius Ryan's great book and the movie that follows, but supposedly Frederick Browning, who was going to be the overall commander for this, had said, you know, I think we just went a bridge too far. Now, there's no evidence that he actually said this, but it's a really neat phrase. But let me just diverge for a second. If he did say it, I'm sorry, it's really nonsensical. Because if this is a bridge too far, then why are we doing this? You know, I mean, then it makes no sense on any level, does it? So I tend to think that Browning probably didn't say that, but it also really does capture the essence of what this was. And we even use that term now in a lot of other contexts, don't we, to describe something that's too ambitious, something that's just biting off more than you can chew, or, you know, whatever, or something that's beyond the pale in terms of what someone says, or, you know. So it all comes from this, this really quite traumatic experience. So British 1st Airborne has the key objective. And then, of course, the two U.S. divisions, 82nd Airborne Division will be in the middle, and then the 101st Airborne Division will be closest to the Allied front line. So let's take a look at that. You're looking here at the aerial corridors too. Again, love it's a busy map, but when you really drink it in, you can just see where it all fits together. So there's the front line, right basically on the Belgian border. 30 Corps is going to go up this way. Notice how their flanks are covered on either side by British 12th Corps and 8th Corps. Now, certainly those are fine units, but they're really under strength, reflecting the British manpower situation and all the hard fighting you've had to do to get to this point. Okay, so 82nd Airborne Division, of course, going to land near Nijmegen, and then the 101st closer to Eindhoven. Now you see where they're coming from too here in southeastern England, those aerial corridors they're going to fly. I think what's remarkable about Market Garden, even though in my opinion it's a really misbegotten concept, a really bad concept, you know, on many levels that they shouldn't have done. But once they do decide, it's a remarkable achievement of planning. He decides on September 10th, and in 1 week, we put together the biggest, airborne operation in human history to that point in time. It'll be exceeded by Operation Varsity later in the war. But, you know, this is pretty enormous here. Now, one of the reasons they're able to do this is they've cycled through about 18 different potential airborne drops in the late summer 1944, all of which had been canceled because the armies had basically overrun the drop zones, and it became, you know, just not necessary. So you're using some of the plans you've already got in place, but the tough coordination is how to fit together the airborne units and their organizational structure with the troop carrier groups and their organizational structure. So how the planes are formed together, who's commanding them, how that fits with an airborne infantry unit or an airborne artillery unit, and who's in command, and how you break it up among the various planes. There's a lot of tough coordination that happens in that 1 week, and I really think it's a remarkable achievement to even be able to pull this off, much less coordinating with the ground troops from 30 Corps, 8th Corps, 12th Corps, and working this all out in the space of 1 week is just absolutely amazing. Something the Allies couldn't have done earlier in the war. So it shows a level of maturity and professionalism that's to some extent off the charts. And of course, much depends obviously on the aviators, right? So the troop carrier folks, they may not be glamorous, but they're the people who are taking you to fight here. And they are doing the heavy lifting, literally. So they are going to call the shots in terms of how this thing works. The airborne folks would like to have them fly 2 missions in 1 day so we can get as much combat power on the ground as possible, as quickly as possible. So, why is this not possible? The 9th Troop Carrier Command under Major General Paul Williams, basically they say no. No can do. Our crews are not trained up for this. Many of them are inexperienced. Many of them are exhausted after flying these shuttle resupply flights, you know, and so no, if we try 2 missions in 1 day, we're going to have crashes, we're going to have accidents. It's going to cause issues. So it's just 1 per day. So that tells you right there you're going to be a bit limited in how this is going to work. But everybody's got to kind of sacrifice for this plan. There's already more sacrifices that are being made too to set up 30 Corps' mobility in order to get to you as well. And this is where, at least from my point of view as an historian, it begins to dawn on you, oh my God, the broad front is going away here in favor of this gamble, basically, to try and end the war. And what I mean by that, 3 U.S. Army infantry divisions had landed in Normandy around this same time, landed across the beaches, and they are going to be immobilized in Normandy, and their trucking stripped from them to give to 30 Corps so that they can have mobility for this operation. Right there, that basically denudes the combat power of all the other Allied armies on this front, in addition to the troop carriers that are now earmarked to this, that had been supplying, say, General Bradley's 12th Army Group, whatever it would be. And so they are, at least their momentum is taken away, and you are taking away from the broad front. The other thing to bear in mind here, look here at this port, Antwerp. The British had captured Antwerp on September 4th, 1944. It was an incredible achievement. They got it against almost no resistance, and they captured the port facilities intact. This is the greatest harbor in Northern Europe. If you have that thing running, it will feed about half of your logistical needs. So you have that in addition to Marseille and Toulon in South France. That's going to do a lot of the job for you to help this broad front. But the problem is, you see from one glance at the map here, Antwerp's an inland harbor. If you don't control the waterways that lead to it, and a lot of this low ground that leads to it, called the Scheldt or Scheldt estuary, you'll hear it pronounced both. If you don't control that, you can't use Antwerp. And guess what? We don't control that. So we are basically weakening any move to clear out the Scheldt or Scheldt estuary, whatever you want to call it, to invest in Market Garden here, which delays having Antwerp in operation and exacerbates your logistical difficulties. So Market Garden, when Eisenhower gives the go-ahead, he doesn't see and understand this, and he only begins to dawn on him as this thing unfolds. Okay, so nonetheless, you have a pretty decent plan in terms of the tactical and the drop zones and all that. One aspect of Market Garden that I think is really undercovered, in my opinion, is the support from the 8th Air Force that helps forge the way here. So the drop day is September 17th. It's a beautiful day, a late summer day, beautiful sunny skies, all that great stuff, exactly what you want. A little chancy to have a daylight drop, but the Germans are so surprised. That's the idea here. Before that happens, though, the B-17s go in, 872 of them, bomb targets in the Netherlands and in Western Germany. Their goal, neutralize the anti-aircraft guns, and help support that the transport planes that are bringing in paratroopers and also gliders, who are also a big part of this too. So it's a milk run compared to a lot of the deep penetration raids in Germany that you would have had as a bomber crewman at that point and earlier in the war. But the flyers love the idea of helping these ground troops, playing that part, and they especially love the idea of bombing the flak batteries. That's your number one enemy at this point in the war, the flak batteries that are going to shoot you down. So they love the idea of doing this against very little opposition. They bomb these guys, barracks, troop bivouacs, all that stuff. By noon, the loss of 2 aircraft, and another one, by the way, that exploded on takeoff back in England. That was always a peril you would have as a bomber crewman. So you lose 3 aircraft total. They dropped about 3,000 tons of bombs, and almost half landed within 1,000 feet of their targets. That's really good accuracy by the standards of heavy bombers in that era. In their wake, P-51 fighter planes come in and strafe and inflict more damage. So they do a lot of damage to the German anti-aircraft capacity. They don't, of course, destroy it altogether. So in the meantime, as the map shows you, the troop carrier armadas follow in their wake. 1,544 transport planes, 478 gliders, enormous. Take off from airfields all over England. This armada is so huge, so loud, that life in southeastern England basically ground to a halt. There were traffic jams on the roads as people were gawking at the skies overhead. Church services were halted as people left church to go and look at all the planes. There was a band concert going on in North London that had to stop because no one could hear the band. The engines of the plane were so incredibly loud, no one could even hear what the band was playing, even if they were standing right next to them. It was incredible. Phone conversations became impossible. All these engines droning overhead. So you can imagine how the excitement that's crackling in southeastern England. What's afoot here? What's going on? Is it the end of the war? All this stuff. The planes above had such, really, I think, quintessentially American nicknames, painted on the planes. Idiot's Delight, Channel Ferry, Sleepy Time Gal, Bouncin' Babe, Misbehavin', Damn Yankee. You have to have Damn Yankee, don't you? I mean, no matter where you're from, that just works. So inside were sticks of those paratroopers like the guys we just saw in the image a moment ago. The gliders, what did they have? Artillery pieces, like small artillery pieces, ammo, supplies, jeeps, communications equipment, engineers, other specialists, and they are piloted by overworked glider pilots. These guys are like the mavericks among the pilots of that era. They've been rejected in many cases from being a power pilot. They got a chip on their shoulder. They're adventurers. They like the idea of getting into a glider that has no power and trying to, fly that thing down and land it somewhere, which was extremely dangerous. It was one of the coolest things about researching that book, was corresponding and getting to know a lot of these guys. And just that personality endured even to old age. Just something very different about them versus the power pilots and versus the soldiers on the ground or whatever. A distinct identity, So the other thing that's really funny about them, but also revealing, On the British side, the glider pilots are also trained as combat infantry because the British need to maximize their manpower. So when they get on the ground, they fight alongside the infantry. Not the U.S. They were part of the Army Air Force, and the Army Air Force was like, no, we're not part of the ground forces. These are our guys. Don't you dare train them up as infantry, even if they'll help save their lives. You know, that kind of thing. this sort of institutional clash here. So they're like, all right, I guess it's a hands off. So when they get on the ground, they just kind of wander around and look for trouble and you know, and say, hey guys, can I help? Or, you know, and so General Gavin, James Gavin, the 37-year-old commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, was so frustrated with them. I found this memo that he wrote about how they're a nuisance. They're just a nuisance to have these guys around. And so they had these vague orders. Once on the ground, gravitate west, get back to Belgium, and then maybe we'll have you fly another mission or something. But would you really do that? You know, you'd probably wander around and see what's what, you know. So it's just so funny how they did it back then. But so they overflow some of the flooded areas of Holland, heading straight for their drop zones, as the paratroopers called it, or the landing zones, as the gliders called it. German anti-aircraft fire, non-existent in some spots, very heavy in others, just kind of depended where you were. There were specially trained Pathfinder teams that went in first to mark these zones, of course. They jump in about 20 minutes ahead of the main serials. In general, the airborne drops were quite accurate, remarkably smooth, because it's partially a daylight. You know, there were minimal losses, but the Germans shot down 35 C-47s, so this is no cakewalk, depending where you were. And, you know, in most cases, the paratroopers are jumping clear and clean, but there are some cases where they're having to jump out of aircraft that are dying. And there are multiple cases in Operation Market in which the C-47 pilots basically sacrificed their own lives and safety to get the paratroopers down. One example I'll give you, Lieutenant Herbert Schillman. He is dropping paratroopers from the 501st Parachute Infantry near Veckel, and his plane is going down, and he basically says, don't worry about me, I'm going to drop these troops on the DZ. It's exactly what he did with the sacrifice of his life. There were at least 3 others who did much the same kind of thing. You know, so again, this was no cakewalk, but a lot of these guys, by the way, had a little bit of a chip on their shoulder after the Normandy drop that's so scattered everywhere, and a lot of them got blamed for it, I think unfairly. And so they're determined, we're getting these guys down where they're supposed to be. So the drops were pretty good. Most of the paratroopers experienced pretty soft landings, almost like training, or better than training in many cases. Their biggest fear is generally crowded drop zones, where you got a lot of people around, a lot of equipment coming down, a lot of other troopers above you. There are some tragic instances of equipment bundles hitting people in the head and killing them, you know, that kind of weird situation and tragic. You know, so the parachutes they have, you'll notice if they're camouflage color, that's airborne. That's the paratroopers. If it's a silk parachute, that's an aviator parachute, typically. And in some cases, the parachutes were color-coded if they're dropping supplies, so like red for ammo, that kind of thing. So there's, of course, exceptions to these soft landings. Captain Lou Hopfleisch, who was personnel officer at 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry, landed on the roof, through like the roof of a house in a town called Overassault. He said, I crashed through the tiled rooftop, suffered leg injuries as a result. He just hobbled around for the rest of Market Garden. The house, by the way, is still there, you know, where you can see where Lou dropped. And I mean, it's just, you know, so there were some, you know, instances like that. General Gavin landed in a turnip field. He had a really hard landing. And he's immediately afterwards in the middle of a firefight. His Dutch liaison officer, Captain Arie Besterbiertje, basically saved his life by killing a German machine gun team that could have killed General Gavin. Besterbiertje, by the way, is linking up with Dutch resistance, which is a huge part of this, the whole Dutch political sphere in this that I think is important to remember too. So Gavin, this is one mistake I will criticize him for. I think he's an incredible commander, but he did not designate a successor in case something happened to him. He had no assistant division commander. If he'd been killed in that firefight or captured or whatever, the 101st 82nd Airborne would have been plunged into succession chaos. But he's lucky, you know. So a lot of times good or he's lucky and they go together. So Gavin, by the way, he had that hard landing I mentioned. He didn't know it until years later. He broke a couple of vertebrae. So it tells you how tough this guy is too. Like, you know, going around for the rest of Market Garden, the war, he's existing for years, and oh, by the way, you broke a couple of vertebrae when you landed in Holland. Oh, all right, you know. I mean, that's the mindset here. So the gliders of both of these divisions came in about an hour after the paratroopers were on the ground. and it secured their landing zones. Glider landings were perilous, as they always were, but stressful, but largely successful. Only 2 gliders in the 82nd serial did not make it down. The 101st, 53 of 70 made it. 3 aborted over England. 1 ditched in the Channel. You may have noticed. You can see, the recovery folks, the rescue folks that are in the Channel there. So if any planes go down or whatever, so there's at least 1 glider that's recovered that way, that ditches. A couple went down in Belgium. Some rest shot down. A couple collided in air. So time is of the essence. The soldiers knew they had to move rapidly to get their objectives. This is a coup de main, right? The Germans are stunned. They're surprised. Let's take advantage of that. So all over the drop zones, Allied soldiers are moving with incredible urgency. The British, of course, up at the Arnhem area, pretty quickly get penned in to a town called Oosterbeek, which is a suburb about 4 miles, 5 miles from the key bridge. And most of the division is penned in there. And of course, famously, Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Frost's battalion ends up fighting its way to the objective and really getting cut off there and fighting for its life at the bridge over the Rhine, the supposed bridge too far. And of course, that's a whole story that has tended to really occupy front and center of our attention for good reason. I'm focusing a little more on what's going on south of there. The 101st Airborne Division, to give you a sense of this, there's their landing zone. They're, again, around the Eindhoven area. And, largely successful, but, and this is a little bit of a harbinger, the 502nd Parachute Infantry, you'll notice in the western side of our drop zones there, is going to get into some pretty heavy fighting around Best, the Best bridges there, and in the Zonche Forest. What that means is the Germans are reacting to this quicker than we expected. German reinforcements are going to be coming from east and west in these scratch forces. The Germans are not on their last legs. They're in trouble, but they still have some fight. And so the 101st Airborne is seeing that almost immediately, like the 502nd there, and the 501st up around Veckel and Erde. It's the same pattern. The 506 is moving southward. See where it says the Wilhelmina Canal? Right here, you've got to have that, obviously to get Eindhoven, but the town of Sun or Zun. And this is where you're going to link up with 30 Corps with the armor coming from the Belgian border. Now, 30 Corps has run into more anti-tank opposition than they ever expected. Here again, the Germans stronger than we had thought. So they're moving more slowly than we had thought. And the other thing that really happens is that, to cause problems, the Germans blow up the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal there, right in the face of the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment as they're fighting their way toward it, including the famous Easy Company, the Band of Brothers. So it's blown up in their faces. Okay, now infantry can move across there on planks or wade through quite uncomfortably, but they can do it. But vehicles, that's another matter. So that means we've got to build a bridge here, anew. That costs 36 hours. The problem with Market Garden, it's a zero defect operation. If one thing goes wrong, everything goes wrong. So when we lose that time, 1st Airborne up around Arnhem doesn't have that time, do they? And the Germans have more time to react, no matter where we're talking about here, and it ends up as a very, very difficult, problematic thing. So you're seeing that already. The 82nd Airborne, something of the same kind of thing. Now you're looking at their drop zone. Look how ambitious that is. This is a 25-plus mile front for an understrength Airborne Division that is not going to be in full strength on the ground on September 17th. In fact, its glider complement of glider infantry, the 325th, isn't going to be able to get in until September 23rd because of bad weather in England. So General Gavin is being asked basically to do 2 major missions here that would be a challenge for 2 airborne divisions, much less 1. To control what's called the Groesbeck Heights. Now, we say heights, that's basically a glorified hilltop or ridgeline. This is Holland we're talking about, okay? So any ridgeline, that's the heights because everything else is so incredibly flat. But whoever controls that higher ground, the Groesbeck Heights, this forest area, the Reichswald, and this neck of Western Germany, whoever controls that can look down the throats of anybody in Nijmegen and anybody around here to lob artillery into them, so that's why you gotta have it. And of course, you've got to have all these bridge objectives, including the capstone ones here in Nijmegen itself, the rail and road bridges. That is a big gulp. So bridges 7 through 10 that you're looking at here, pretty quickly things go sideways there. The Germans destroy or damage most of them except for one. The only one you capture intact is Bridge 7. that is taken by the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Lieutenant Lloyd Paulette, and his guys take this in an incredibly valorous small unit operation. That's kind of your one win. It's great. You've got Bridge 7. You wanted all these bridges in order to disperse your combat power as you get across and go into Nijmegen, not just the 82nd Airborne, but all those tanks and other vehicles coming from 30 Corps once you link up, right? So you now have to funnelize everything through Bridge 7. See how that's going to rob you of momentum? Much less what's going on down there at Sun, when the British engineers, once they link up with the 101st to try and repair that bridge. So again, when this goes wrong, everything goes wrong. And when the Germans begin putting pressure on Gavin's eastern front here, around the Groesbeck Heights, which they soon will, with reinforcements coming out of here, we've got more problems, don't we? So the larger theme, the Germans are not collapsing. Far from it. They're reacting as they often do. One thing the Germans are really good at in this war, when they take a blow to the face, they come back and they counterattack. They put together scratch forces. They find a way to plug gaps. They're very, very resilient. You'd seen that on the Eastern Front. You see it here too in Market Garden. So in effect, you know, you're talking about an operation that has really lost its momentum, really in the early phases. Now, one major win you do have is down here in this southwestern portion of the 82nd Airborne Sector at the Grave Bridge. That is the over the Waal River, W-A-A-L. That is that bridge is the largest and most modern in Europe at that point in time. It is taken from the southern side by Lieutenant John Jocko Thompson and a small scratch platoon. And then you have other guys coming from the north. They're all from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. But Thompson's people play the main role in overwhelming a pillbox that's defending the bridge area right around here. And like a little command center too. They overwhelm the Germans with bazooka fire and really a lightning kind of assault. What I think is fascinating about this is Thompson's actual personal background. He was a former minor league baseball player, a pitcher in the Boston Red Sox organization. And I really, this is only my opinion, but I really think that what you see in his actions here, because he could have just hunkered down and said, well, wait for reinforcements and then, you know, then we'll go once we have everything all lined up. No, you go straight ahead with this take charge mentality of like a pitcher would have. I'm in control of the game and it's up for me to basically set the tone for this game. Thompson totally has that mentality. And it really pays off here. So the Grave Bridge is captured intact, and that does help once 30 Corps comes into play, you know, a couple days into this, September 19th, so a lot of time has passed. When these tanks link up with 82nd Airborne, yeah, you get through here easily, but then you're bottlenecked through bridge number 7, and you're funnelized up the rest of the way. So that's your situation. You have German reaction in all of these spots, whether it's the British starting to get cut off around Arnhem, whether it's Gavin's division in crisis here at the Groesbeck Heights, and increasingly in Nijmegen itself, and the 101st Airborne Division down trying to hold either side of what the Americans soon dub Hell's Highway, that road net that you're capturing through Holland here to go all the way to Arnhem and beyond. So, tough situation then, isn't it? To tell you a little bit about the crisis that happens. This is on the second day of the operation. You have glider-borne units that are going to be coming in along the Groesbeck Heights that we've captured initially, but now the Germans come and take it back. So I was talking about how this whole eastern flank is in crisis here. It's ebb and flow. So we've got gliders scheduled to come in and land on areas the Germans actually control at that point. It's a problem, isn't it? And by the way, we have no communication with the planes and the gliders and paratroopers. You know, we are the paratroopers on the ground. We can't communicate with them, so they don't know. So the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, under Gavin's direction, is basically going to have to go into a headlong frontal attack to recapture those landing zones before the gliders come down. And this is happening almost like something out of a movie, in a sense of, you know, minutes count. And they basically overwhelm the German defenders in these frontal assaults. And I mean, they capture and destroy 16 anti-aircraft guns. They capture 150 Germans. They kill 50. They clear these landing zones just in time for the gliders to come down. But it costs things. It costs the life of a company commander named Captain Anthony Stefanich. He comes from the 505th Parachute Infantry. They're also involved too. And he had been beloved ever since North Africa, in command of this unit. And, he's basically dying there. And one of his soldiers watching this, Private Arthur Dutch Schultz, who will later be made famous in The Longest Day, the book, and the movie. Dutch Schultz remembered seeing his company commander dying. He said, "It's difficult to put into words the love we felt for this man. He was not only a symbol of leadership, he was a symbol of innocence." And like something out of a movie, Stefanich, as he's dying, tells his XO, Jack Tallerday, says, "Jack, take care of my troopers and the company. We've come a long way together. You're the best friend and officer I know. Give my love to my family and tell them I did my best." It just grabs you, It's and so that's what this cost. They do it successfully, but the Germans are going to come back. They're coming back the next day. So we're constantly in crisis at this stage, and that's a microcosm. So the other thing that's interesting to note about this early phase of Market Garden, the 8th Air Force is used to resupply. So in this case, it's 252 B-24s that are stripped down, rejiggered so that you can drop supplies to these guys. And you can imagine the aviators just loved that mission too, that they could see how they were helping people. But this was a dangerous mission. You're flying low, you're not that well armed, and those anti-aircraft units are shooting at you. This is very, very difficult. But they pull it off. I could hardly speak from emotion. Lieutenant Daniel Budd, who was a pilot in one of these B-24s, wrote in his diary, "Whole towns are out in the yards waving. Old men and women and small kids. Everyone waving their shirts, expressions on people's faces." The war had been impersonal, bombing from 20,000 feet. Now it was personal, wasn't it? Almost every B-24 made it, but almost all of them were damaged. So most of the aviators never forgot that experience, as you might imagine. So over the next 48 hours now, as we get to the climax of this whole story, Market Garden really begins to degenerate into a bitter struggle as German reinforcements come into the mix from both east and west, up in Arnhem, up in Nijmegen, all of this kind of stuff. The highway is under enormous crisis. General Maxwell Taylor, the commander of our 1st Airborne Division, will later compare holding that highway to like cavalry troopers in the Old West trying to hold on against Native American attacks on either side of a railroad or whatever, or a road. And it's really true. This Hell's Highway is constantly in crisis, not just these first few days, but of course for many, many days thereafter. So that's absorbing a lot of your strength to try and hold on there, and much less try and get armor and everything else through to where it needs to go. So from an American point of view, this early stage of the fighting, everything climaxes, of course, on September 20th, when troopers from the 504th Parachute Infantry are going to be asked to get aboard boats and cross the Vaal River. Okay, so here it is. The Vaal River, actually, the Moss River is the Grave Bridge. I apologize for that. But the Vaal River here, you're going to cross in boats. Why are you doing that? Because you've tried to fight your way to these bridges through the urban maw of Nijmegen, and it has been a stalemate. So now we're going to get across boats, row across by hand, and we're going to go straight into the Germans, and we're going to overwhelm them, and we're going to capture the bridges from the north side there, even as we hope other forces are coming from the south side, including British armor that is now linked up with us. This is the afternoon of September 20th, 1944. 3rd Battalion 504th Parachute Infantry is going to be asked to do this, told, basically. Major Julian Cook is resentful of this mission. He feels this is a death and suicide mission, and he resents it. He's played by Robert Redford, famously in A Bridge Too Far, and I think very well, in my opinion. But so he's thought to himself, we're being asked to make an Omaha Beach landing all by ourselves. That's what they're thinking. And just, it absorbs most of the day for British engineers in their trucks to get those rickety boats up to these guys. That's how in crisis the corridor is at this point. And one of the trucks gets blown up, so there's fewer boats than you would have had. I mean, sometimes these engineers get criticized. I think these guys do an amazing job to get there at all, in my opinion. So they get there the afternoon of September 20th. It begins just after 3 o'clock that day. This assault straight across, basically across the Vaal River, and then to capture these bridges. It is an absolute slaughter on some levels. The sky was actually hailing bullets, one soldier remembered. They kicked up little spouts of water like a hailstorm on the water. For PFC Lawrence Dunlop, a machine gunner, the river became, quote, like a boiling pan of water. Another guy said it was like a school of piranha in a feeding frenzy. The paratroopers, as they go across, are paddling with either little paddles or their rifle butts or their hands. So these are not powered boats. And they are fish in a barrel there. They're terrified, they're angry, they're full of adrenaline. They're taking a lot of fire from the rail bridge. See the flanking fire you would get there? Some of it's 20 millimeter anti-aircraft fire. Any one of those rounds will take off the better part of your arm or blow your head off. There's a number of instances, really troubling, when paratroopers have their heads blown off, either by 20 millimeter fire or particularly effective machine gun fire. It's horrifying. We look like a bunch of animals, void of dignity and normalcy, one of the soldiers later said. Major Cook was so terrified that he kept repeating the better part of the Hail Mary over and over. He was a Roman Catholic. That's a crisis prayer for Roman Catholics. So he's just repeating Hail Mary, full of grace, over and over again. This is really well portrayed in the movie. Delbert Keel, his incredibly courageous chaplain, kept saying, "Lord, thy will be done." You know, and he'd seen a lot of combat by that point in the war. Dozens were killed and wounded. Blood literally ran into the water. Many of the boats sank or were riddled with holes. About half of them made it across. The engineers, by the way, airborne engineers, were the ones piloting the boats nominally, but recovering them and going back. Notice how there's multiple waves, as the map shows you. They go back to get more guys. So what happens when you get across? Man, were they bloodthirsty. You've been a vulnerable target going across, right? You're angry at these guys who have taken advantage of that to shoot at you. And so this is one of those moments when the American infantry soldiers, in this case, will give no quarter. They will kill everybody they find there without any recourse at all. And a lot of these guys who are facing them here on that embankment that you're looking at, which looks right down at the river, they're the backwater of manpower. They're like 60-year-old men, 15-year-old kids, and all this. They're begging for their lives. The paratroopers shoot them down in droves. When they start to move toward the bridges here, there are Germans caught between the attacking forces on both sides on the rail bridge. By the records I studied, they claimed 267 of them were killed on that bridge. Some of them jumped into the water to drown there or try to swim away. Most of them just killed like fish in a barrel there on the rail bridge. I was skeptical of that number, but it's like everywhere. It's on the German side, it's on the American side, and you're like, wow, they were there, I wasn't. I guess that's true, So of course, famously, the road bridge is taken by Cook and his survivors. The late afternoon, early evening, they link up with the British tanks. The concern about the British tanks, of course, going across is that the Germans will blow the bridge. It doesn't happen, and there's all sorts of explanations you'll hear for that. The sort of standard Dutch national explanation is that a Dutch resistance fighter went in there and cut the cables. There's almost no chance that's true. I'm sorry. I greatly respect Jan van Hoof, the guy they're talking about. He was very courageous. There's almost no way he could have done that. But I understand why the Dutch have latched on to that. The other thing is the idea that like the Americans cut the cables. That could be too, but I think more precisely, it's probably the bombardment going on. That had really fouled a lot of the cables, the wires, explosives, and the evidence of that is that there were a lot of German engineers on the bridge when the Americans and British attacked. That's probably why they're there, to try and repair what had been damaged. But who knows? We still don't know for sure. But the tanks get across, and the Americans had the notion they're going to go all the way to Arnhem and rescue, and everything's going to be great. It's going to be like a movie, right? Well, it's just a few tanks. What are they really going to be able to do up in Arnhem? And which perimeter are you going to go to? Frost? Or are you going to go to the rest of the division over at Oosterbeek? Okay, this is the misbegotten side of this. The paratroopers are very angry. They fixate on the British stopping and brewing tea and all that kind of stuff, but it's grossly unfair on many levels, but it's just part of the tragedy of Market Garden, that no matter how hard we were going to fight here, we were not going to rescue this failed operation. It had turned into a rescue operation, and even that we couldn't work out. Remember, 30 Corps is a mess at that point. Vehicles are snaking all the way back to Belgium, the whole accordion effect. They're under constant harassment of German counterattacks, fighting hard just to keep the corridor open. 30 Corps is fighting 3 different battles, one to keep the corridor open, one to hold the Grossbeck Heights, one to make it to Arnhem. How are you going to make that work? It guarantees failure. And of course, the British have no infantry to send along either. Now, they probably should have tried, but they were going to fail, unfortunately. So the operation ends, around this time, in September, and I won't bore you with all that. But it's said to last 9 days, September 17th to 26th, by the time we realize this isn't going to work. But the Airborne Division, the British 1st Airborne Division, is largely lost around Arnhem, of course, and the 2 U.S. divisions are going to continue to fight in Holland for the rest of the fall of 1944. So during the market garden phase, like that first 9-10 days, they suffer about 40 to 50% casualties. That next couple of months, when we're there until November, about 40 to 50% more. So by the time you're pulled out of there in November, that's the state of these 2 airborne divisions. So think about that, because it's incredible to realize they're put in reserve and then famously claimed to fight the Battle of the Bulge, of course, when that happens in mid-December 1944. They do pretty darn well, if you ask me, given everything they've been through, But these guys basically fought their guts out for what they hoped would be the end of the war. What we get out of it, if there's anything, is liberation of some portions of Holland here, and this friendship between the Americans and the Dutch that still exists to this day, which I think is really embodied in this image of young Dutch, probably resistance fighters, helping the U.S. paratroopers, in this case, guys from the 101st, working together like that. And so it's a tragedy on many levels. Some see, the Dutch see it, who live in that area, the corridor that's liberated, as Liberation Day. But remember, the rest of the country is not liberated, and some of it will have famine in it that the Germans deliberately provoke with the loss of thousands of Dutch lives. You can imagine the trauma. But even those in the liberated corridor, the price of liberation was that their homes became battlegrounds. And that'll be true for months and months and months. So the whole thing is really just a very sad tale in the end in this respect. So the conclusions I have, and I'd love to leave it open for plenty of questions too. Ultimate responsibility for Market Garden's failure rests, in my opinion, with Eisenhower. It wasn't his concept, that's true, but he gave the go-ahead. He made so many good decisions, we could never even document them all. He was an amazing commander. This was his worst decision. He's human. You make mistakes. We understand why he made the decision, but it wasn't the right call. And it had terrible, terrible consequences. Again, you're getting my opinion here. The fun of it is we could argue and talk about it forever, right? And we still do, 80 years on. He took his eye off the ball of what should have been the primary objective at that point, Antwerp. If you get Antwerp, you now have a lot of options in front of you, especially for the broad front. And I certainly am an unrepentant advocate of the broad front, so you have to know I'm coming from that standpoint. It just makes more sense, and it's what they're going to do ultimately. So when Market Garden fails, it consigns us to a winter of war, another winter of warfare, right? It also, by the way, leads to the Battle of the Bulge, because when Market Garden happens, Hitler decides to launch his own counteroffensive that he starts to plan at that point and then unleashes in mid-December. Second, the plan is based mainly on hope. Hope that the Germans are finished. Hope that the bridges will be intact. Hope that the armor will advance. Hope that everything will go right. Hope that the military Hail Mary pass will be completed 70 yards down the field, right? That's just probably not going to happen. Third, the Americans who fought in Holland were consigned to a battle of sheer desperation from the beginning almost to the end. Most would really never be the same, and they really remembered this vividly for the rest of their lives. And of course, as I said, the failure of Market Garden guarantees that the war is going to continue in 1945. No Antwerp, no supplies, German recovery, divergence through the broad front. So Gavin summed it up best, I think. He kept a diary through the war, fascinating, insightful stuff. And he wrote after they were, pulled out in November. He said, the high hopes of the late summer 44 faded with the first chill of an early winter. You can almost feel that chill, can't you? Yeah. So I'll leave it at that. If you have questions, I would love to answer them. Thank you. Yes, sir. Is there a mic coming around, or should we just? I'll hear it. Okay. Go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit about this? There seems to be a divergence in how Brits seem to view this versus us. Well, and maybe I'm over dramatizing it, but it seems like for lost causers, Pickett's charge is always the if only it had worked. And for a lot of Brits, this seems like if only these 2 or 3 things had been different, it would have been successful.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. So in case you didn't hear, I'll repeat the question to make sure everybody hears. There seems to be a kind of lost cause element to this, almost like Pickett's charge. Okay, if only this would have worked, then everything, flows from that. And the British in particular seem to have that attitude. And I think that's very insightful because the other day I was talking market guard with my co-host, James Holland, who is British. If you don't know him, he's British. He's an amazing historian. And he's been walking the ground there. He's been immersed in this for the 80th anniversary. And he said, the more I study it, the more I think it could have worked. And so I was like, so I greatly respect his opinion, but I'm like, well, what does worked mean? Because my point all along has been, what's the strategic purpose of this? Are we going to Berlin? Do we really think we're going to go across northern Germany all the way to Berlin unmolested without major attacks on a corridor, by the way, just like we saw in Holland? And once we do get to Berlin, guess what? That's a major urban area, and they're probably going to fight very hard there, as happened to the Soviets in April and May 1945. So to me, it's like, okay, maybe we could get across the Rhine, but is that really worth all the cost of everything else? So yes, I mean, it's all in our perspectives. I think you're exactly right. And I think maybe from a British perspective, you know what? They lost some of the cream of their army there. Something has to be worthwhile about that in the end. And something has to come out of these incredible soldiers who fought to the end. And I guess I would look at it the same way. I greatly respect his opinion, but I also just have to ask how we define worked. Because I just don't see it the same way, I guess. Yeah.
And another thing Holland has talked about recently and also before is Gavin's decision to or not to go for the bridge on that first day. And there's a lot of paperwork on that over the years, too. Where do you come down on that?
Don't I know it? Yeah. So let's go back and look at this. So, yeah, this is a lot of criticism of General Gavin for not grabbing the Nijmegen Bridge early on, not prioritizing that, for investing too much and hanging on to the Groesbeck Heights. Where I come down on that is I think blaming Gavin for that failure is like blaming a firefighter for the fire that broke out in the building that he's trying to put out the fire. This concept is so incredibly ambitious here. How is he going to, I mean, as I made the point, you're talking about something that if you had 2 airborne divisions here was going to be a challenge. Take Nijmegen and these key bridges and take these heights and hold them against the powerful German counterattacks that are coming. He's got basically 70% of his division down to basically do all those objectives. And the evidence of the overstretch is that on the day of the Wall crossing on September 20th, he's there hoping to watch the whole thing and have an effect. And he gets called away because of a crisis at the Groesbeck Heights because they're about to lose their control over that. And if they do, the Germans are going to pound the guys going across the Wall River with artillery. So to me, to blame Gavin for this is absurd. Now, where a lot of the blame will fixate is not taking the bridge and prioritizing to take it early, okay? And where this comes down is that you were supposed to go in on this side here rather than through the urban maw to capture that road bridge. Now, it is documented that Gavin stood with his regimental commander, Roy Lindquist, and told him to do precisely that. He said, don't get bogged down in the maw, the city. Go on this outflanking area here where not much is, and you can get there and you can grab the bridge pretty quickly. And this wasn't just Gavin doing a kind of a CYA later. His operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Norton, who eventually retired as a 3-star, he was there, documented it all in his notes. I've seen those notes. He did that. So you can tell your subordinate to do something, but when he gets on the ground and he gets distracted, as Lindquist did, by what he thought was a Dutch resistance guy giving him a good guide to the bridge, when that happens, I mean, how is Gavin really at fault for that on many levels? Because what happens is this guy probably wasn't Dutch resistance. He was probably a collaborator, and he was misleading them, and they get tied down and fighting in the urban maw. But I'll also make the point. Do we imagine for 1 minute that if we grab this bridge within the first day or so, that the Germans are just going to say, okay, well, you've won here. Okay. No, there were elements of the 10th SS, 9th SS Panzer Reconnaissance. There was a Kampfgruppe called Kampfgruppe Hankey that was coming into the area, that was descending down there, and they would have contested that. And so, as I often say, you would have been frosted. In other words, like what happens to frost at the Rhine bridge is probably going to happen to whoever gets to that bridge early on. So, I mean, I've been round and round on this and a lot of podcasts and whatever. I just think it's so incredibly unfair to blame Gavin. While I'll also say to you, I'm not just going to defend him because I think he's a fine commander. Where I think he made mistakes, I'll point that out, like with the succession thing. I think he erred badly there and he got away with it. In this case, though, I just think it's pretty unfair, in my opinion. Yes, sir?
But, I mean, you alluded to it briefly, but was there, and they talk about this in the movie, the intelligence failure of knowing that the SS divisions were there?
Right.
Was that information getting to anybody, and were they believing it?
Yeah, so yeah, and, you know, drawing from the movie, the elements of the two SS Panzer divisions, 9th and 10th SS, that are refitting around the Arnhem area. What about the intel? Do the Allies know that? Is it getting down to the people who know it and all that? The answer is pretty much yes. Now, we have to point out, 9th and 10th SS are not in good shape. Like a lot of German formations, they've really been beaten up. And so they're refitting, but you know what? There's still a core of resistance that could cause some serious problems for you, even if their vehicles aren't all operational, whatever. So yeah, that is pretty well portrayed, I think, in the movie, of this kind of, once we've decided on the operation, we're not going to let anything diverge us from it. Because remember, they'd canceled about, what, 18 previous airborne operations, and the idea was this one's going to go. And you can kind of understand in the sense of saying we can't just dissuade ourselves from this operation because we have a little bit more enemy presence there than we expected. We think we can deal with that. But so, you know, they might have gotten lucky, and maybe the Germans wouldn't have reacted well with all these other reinforcements that come into play, and we deal with 9th and 10th SS and beat them there. But they weren't lucky, you know. So we tend to give them all that opprobrium. And whose fault is that? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around. I think in the end, it's the concept that's at fault that is going to lead to those kind of decisions, just in my opinion. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What's your take on Matt Ridgway during this? He has 2 divisions. What's he doing?
Yeah.
Does he play any role? How's that impact him moving forward into later war and post-war?
Yeah, it impacts him a lot. I'm glad. So the question is, what's General Matthew Ridgway doing at this point in time? What's my take on him? I'm glad you asked. I'm writing a biography of him, so I have a definite take. Maybe more than you want to hear. But so all right. So a little context here. Matthew Ridgway is really the senior American airborne officer. He is really the most accomplished Allied airborne officer, I would argue, as of September 1944. He has, of course, successfully led the 82nd Airborne Division, pioneered it into existence, led it successfully in Sicily and in Normandy, and he's been promoted to command of 18th Airborne Corps, which consisted of the 2 U.S. Airborne Divisions, and then soon to be 17th Airborne that was going to be coming into play as well. So he quite rationally, I think, felt that he should have been in command here. Instead, it goes to Browning, who had not had Ridgway's experiences. He commands a kind of what's called the 1st Airborne Corps, and basically 82nd and 101st are poached and sent into that under Browning's command. So how would you feel if you were Ridgway, in which your 2 prime assets are taken from you, given to someone else of less accomplishment, less experience, less proficiency as a ground combat commander, let's be honest. Nice, genial fellow, but I'm sorry, he's not as well suited for this mission. So Ridgway is absolutely spitting fire during Operation Market Garden. He is very angry that he is not in command. He's not the type of person to cause issues at a higher level for that. He's not going to parachute in. He's going to go in on the ground once the corridors open more, and he's going to be so angry because he comes under artillery fire. He's stalemated down at times. He's very angry at the lack of aggressiveness he thinks is there for some of the 30 Corps troops. He's willing to just blame everybody for everything at this point. He's just, have you ever been in one of those nasty, angry moods where you're like just ready for a confrontation? Ridgway's in that place. And what happens here is a little fraying of an otherwise incredibly strong, lifelong relationship between Ridgway and Gavin. That Ridgway is just wandering around the battle area kind of ineffectually, like, how can I help? And it's not his gig. So he comes into the 82nd Airborne Division command post one day at a time when, this will shock you, the Groesbeck Heights are under crisis, and Gavin's dealing with that, like, how am I going to fend them off? And so Gavin's dealing with that, and he doesn't properly report to Ridgway, in Ridgway's view, and Ridgway gets all huffy about it. This was really not like him. He was not officious, but he's looking to be angry about something. And so he asked Gavin later, like through official channels, I want an explanation why you didn't report to me properly. And Gavin gets so put out with this that he's thinking about retiring and all this, like, this is BS, you know. They eventually patch it up. They laughed about it later in life. And Ridgway admitted he was wrong, which also showed the kind of person that he was. But he has really hardly any effect on Market Garden. And I think, and this is just a counterfactual, who knows, I think if Ridgway were in command, it would have been better run. It would have been more efficient in terms of what was prioritized to be on the ground. Famously, Browning earmarks too many gliders and too many aircraft for his own headquarters and things like that I think Ridgway probably wouldn't have done. But Ridgway was one of the, arguably, the finest commander among many, but even he, I don't think, could have rescued this awful concept, in my opinion. Yeah, great question, thank you.
This will be
Yes,
our
sir.
last question.
Oh, bummer.
I read somewhere that the Holland War College said that anybody who backed down that corridor would flunk the test.
Yeah, so this was early in the war. The Dutch, like the Dutch War College or whatever within the Dutch Armed Forces, that they had war gamed this kind of thing a lot. Yeah, and then they you are correct that they had said anybody who tries that frontal attack down this actual corridor will fail the exercise. That they had to come up with some other way to capture the bridges and river systems here.
Because Hell's Highway.
Yeah, the Americans came to call that Hell's Highway, I think with really good reason. So really, if you're an American paratrooper, especially in the 101st, that's what you're doing most of the time, is trying to hold on to Hell's Highway from west or east as they're coming at you from either direction. 82nd, they're mainly coming from the east. But it's in crisis that quickly, and the Dutch do that. And but there's just hope, too, that, here's that word, that the Dutch resistance rising up is going to be able to alleviate some of that somehow. And I mean, the Dutch resistance does a lot of good work here. They're really pretty amazing, and they're more courageous than we could ever know. But again, it's still not enough.
Well, I had heard that they had told Montgomery that too.
They probably had, but you know, Montgomery, I suppose, sees it differently at that point. But yeah, it's a shame. Well, thanks, appreciate it. Thanks.